Hey folks, this is Will here again, and today we'll be looking at how to create some more advanced functionality in Android widgets. In particular, we'll be looking at parsing an RSS feed. For this widget, we'll be parsing the recent questions feed from StackOverflow. If you're not familiar with the site, it's basically a programmer question and answer site. So what we'll be doing is accessing their RSS feed of recent questions, and we'll be taking the 5 most recent ones and displaying the questions in our widget. We're also going to have a button that will allow the user to click, and that will refresh, which will again retrieve the most recent 5 questions. Now, first of all, you can see I have the layout file open here, and as you can see, I have a refresh button and just 5 text fields up top, and those 5 text fields will be the fields where the questions will be displayed, and the refresh button, obviously the user will be allowed to click and refresh the questions. Now let's go take a look at the widget info file of our app. I've just set the min width and height and the initial layout as the layout that you just saw. Now, the widget provider class is where everything happens here. So again, the onUpdate method is the method that gets called when the update broadcast gets received. So in this case, we'll take a look at this right here first of all. I'm creating something called a pending intent. Now, a pending intent object is basically a wrapper for a regular intent, except that it is meant to be run at some time in the future. So you can see I've created a pending intent PI, and then I'm taking the view and I'm setting the pending intent to be run when the button is clicked. The idea is that our pending intent will retrieve all the RSS feed from StackOverflow, and it will parse through it, get what's necessary, and update the view. This should be available for the user when they click refresh. Now, if you look at this intent, one of the parameters, if you look at this pending intent, one of the parameters is this intent right here, which we've created just above here. Now, this intent, I've set it to target this class itself. So you'll see later that we have to create a method to receive that intent when it gets sent. And I've also added a little bit of extra information to that intent, namely all the app widget IDs. So when this class receives that intent, it'll receive the app widget IDs as parameters, and it will be able to update the app widget. I've also given it an action with the string update, and you'll see in a bit why that's useful. Then a little further down here, you'll see I'm running a task, namely an AsyncTask. I'll get into the details a bit later, but at a high level, basically, that is doing the same thing that our pending intent will do when the user clicks refresh. So not only do we want it to refresh the questions when they click the button, but we want it to initially load the questions as well. So that's what we're doing here, and I'll get into details on how this task works a little later. And at the bottom of this, we simply update the widget. Now, like I said, this class now needs a method to receive the broadcasted intent that we set up here. So we do that by overriding the onReceive method. And this onReceive method is called when it receives any broadcasted intent whatsoever. So because there may be many different ones, you have to check that it's the one you think it is. In this way, if you're receiving 2 or 3 different kinds of intents, you can have several different if-else statements and have each one carry out some corresponding action. So in this case, again, what we're actually doing is simply running this task the same way as we did up here. except this is what will get called when the user clicks the refresh button. So let's go actually take a look at this task. Notice that it extends AsyncTask. Now, an async task allows you to run some processing in the background and then also to run some processing after that in the foreground. And the reason that this is required is that what we want to do is retrieve an RSS feed, basically an XML file, from the web. Now, to do this, Android won't let you do it on the main thread. Instead, you have to do it on a background thread. So, to easily do that, or sorry, the best way of doing that is to use an async task, which conveniently provides two methods called doInBackground and onPostExecute. And what it does is, when you call execute of this task, like we did up here, we created a new task and we called execute. When you call execute, it automatically calls the doInBackground method. And this method, all the processing inside it is carried out in a background thread. So this is the method where we're going to want to retrieve the XML feed, the XML file. And then after this method is run, it immediately runs onPostExecute back on the main thread. And since it runs on the main thread, this then allows us again to update our UI, because you're not allowed to update user interface objects on a background thread. So again, we'll look at our async task up here, and it takes some type parameters. First of all, this first parameter we've specified as a type context. What this specifies here is the input type to the doInBackground method. So if you specify context, it will then expect an array of context objects. Now we're only going to be sending it one, which is fine. It's just going to be an array of size 1. The third parameter is what the doInBackground method will be returning. So you can see I've specified a list of StackOverflow question objects, and you can see this method returns questions, which is a list of StackOverflow question objects. The second parameter we've specified as void here. It's actually used to return some feedback on basically some progress updates on what is happening, which we won't be using in this case, so void will do here. Now let's look at our doInBackground method. Again, this is what is carried out in a background thread. This is where we are instantiating a feed parser object, which we'll look at it a bit. It basically is used to parse an RSS feed. So given a URL, here's the URL for the StackOverflow recent questions feed. It's going to retrieve the file, parse it with this method here, and return a list of StackOverflow questions. So here we're returning questions, and what happens is this async task returns these questions, but it calls this method immediately after this method is done, and the parameters to this method is the return of this method. So here we're returning a list of StackOverflow questions, and that return, those questions, end up being the input to this method right here. So in this method, which again gets called on the main thread, we're able to now update the UI. So you can see if there's an exception or if something went wrong, it's simply updating all the text fields to an empty string. And you can see if it went correctly, we're taking the title of the question and displaying it in that text field. Particularly, I'm displaying the title because there's not exactly enough room to display the entire question, as the whole question can be paragraphs long. So the title usually displays enough information to tell the user what the question's about. And again, after that, we're simply updating the widget right here. Now you saw a few other helper classes used in here. The feed parser one in particular. I won't get into too much detail on this, but it's basically using the Java DOM API to parse the XML and traverse the XML, retrieve the nodes that it needs, and here it's looping through and creating a set of StackOverflow question objects, and then again traversing to the items it needs. And I've just retrieved the ID of the question, the title of the question, and the link to the question. There's lots more information available that you could get. We aren't even using all of this at the moment, but so it's retrieving all that information, storing it into a StackOverflow question object, and eventually will return the list of questions. My StackOverflow question object is just a plain old Java object. Very simple, straightforward. So that's basically it. Fairly simple, not too complex once you get the hang of it. But the important thing to note here is that, again, the AsyncTask is what does all of the processing here. Now there is one more thing to take care of before this will work. And if we go to our manifest file here, notice this line right here. This is what allows the widget to access the internet. Without this, it doesn't have permission to access the internet, and it'll throw an exception, and it won't work at all. So make sure this is in your manifest file. And that's basically all we have for today. So you've seen some more advanced stuff with widgets, some intents and pending intents, and you've also learned about the async task, which is very useful to know. So I hope you learned something.